The train arrived without a sound. It did not rush in, did not announce itself, did not disturb the night in any way. One moment there was only fog, and the next, it was simply there, waiting. You stood alone on the platform, beneath a single lantern. Its warm light barely reached the edges of the stone beneath your feet. Beyond it, the world dissolved into pale mist, soft and endless. There were no other travelers, no voices, no wind, only silence, and the quiet presence of the train. You did not remember coming here, and yet something deep inside told you this was where you were meant to be. The doors opened slowly, a soft wooden creak, gentle and unhurried, like the sound of something very old, something that had opened these doors countless times before. Warm light spilled from inside the carriage, cutting softly through the fog. You hesitated for just a moment, not out of fear, but because it felt like stepping across something unseen, as if the moment you entered, something would change, something you would not be able to return from. Still, you stepped forward. The air inside was warmer, softer. It carried the scent of wood, faint wax, and something almost comforting, like a place remembered from long ago. Candles lined the walls of the carriage, their flames steady and calm. The wooden seats were polished smooth, untouched by time. Everything felt still, preserved, as though the train existed outside the world you knew. Behind you, the door closed. No sound, just a quiet certainty that it would not open again the same way. For a moment, the train did not move. It rested there, surrounded by fog, as if waiting for something or someone. Then, so gently you could barely feel it, it began to glide forward. There was no jolt, no rhythm of wheels, only motion, smooth and endless. You took a seat by the window. Outside there was nothing. No sky, no ground, no horizon, only the slow drifting fog, wrapping itself around the train, swallowing the tracks before you could see where they led. It was impossible to tell how fast you were moving, or how far you had already gone. Your reflection faintly appeared in the glass, pale and distant. For a moment, it almost didn't feel like your own. Then it faded. You let your gaze soften, watching the fog as it moved in slow, gentle waves. Time seemed to stretch here, or perhaps it simply didn't exist at all. Somewhere in the carriage, a quiet presence shifted. You turned slightly. Across from you, seated in silence, was another passenger. You were certain they had not been there before. A figure in a dark cloak, their face hidden beneath a hood. They did not move, did not look at you, did not acknowledge your presence in any way. They simply sat there, as if they had always been there. The candlelight touched the edge of their sleeve, revealing worn fabric, old and carefully kept. Their hands rested still, folded gently in their lap. There was nothing threatening about them, and yet something felt distant, unreachable. You looked away. The train continued forward, deeper into the mist. The silence grew softer, heavier, almost like a blanket settling over your thoughts. Even your breathing seemed quieter now, slower, matching the calm rhythm of the moving train. Without thinking, you reached into your pocket. Your fingers brushed against paper. You pulled it out. A ticket. You did not remember receiving it. The surface was aged, slightly rough beneath your fingertips. Strange symbols were printed across it. lines and shapes that almost formed letters, but not quite. They seemed to shift when you tried to focus on them, slipping just beyond understanding. There was no destination written, no time, no explanation, only your name. You stared at it for a moment longer, then turned it over. Blank. When you looked up again, the seat across from you was empty. The cloaked figure was gone. You hadn't heard them move, hadn't felt the slightest change in the air. They were simply no longer there. For a brief moment, a quiet unease touched your chest, but it passed just as quickly. The warmth of the carriage remained, the candles continued to flicker, and the train did not slow. Somewhere further down the aisle, a soft glow appeared. A lantern. Its light moved slowly between the rows of seats, steady and warm, cutting gently through the dimness. The conductor. He walked with calm, measured steps, his presence as quiet as everything else on this train. His uniform was old, darker than the shadows around him, but carefully kept, as though it had never known where. When he reached you, he stopped. For a moment, he said nothing. He simply looked at you. His eyes were calm, distant, as if he had seen this moment many times before. "Ticket," he said softly. You handed it to him. He studied it for a long time, the lantern light flickering across the strange symbols. Then, slowly, he nodded, as if everything was exactly as it should be. He returned the ticket to your hand, and without another word, he moved on. His lantern drifted away, its glow growing smaller, until it disappeared completely into the quiet of the carriage. Outside, the fog shifted. Something began to take shape within it. Dark forms, tall and still. Trees. A forest, emerging slowly from the mist, its branches stretching high above, fading into white. The train moved between them, deeper and deeper, as the world beyond the windows began to exist again. But only just. The light inside the carriage dimmed slightly. The candles flickered, and the train continued forward, without end. The forest grew thicker as the train moved forward. The trees stood close to the tracks now, their dark trunks rising like silent watchers from the fog. Their branches twisted high above, forming shapes that shifted with the drifting mist. Sometimes they looked like arches, sometimes like figures standing still, just beyond clear sight. You kept your gaze on the window. There was something calming about the repetition, the slow passing of shadow and pale light, the gentle rhythm of movement without sound. It felt as though the world outside no longer belonged to time. Inside the carriage, everything remained quiet. Too quiet. You glanced down the aisle. The seats were mostly empty now. You were certain there had been more passengers before. Not many, but enough that the space had felt shared. Now, the emptiness stretched further than you remembered, each row untouched, each candle burning steadily beside it. Only one figure remained, the old woman. She sat near the far end of the carriage, her posture unchanged, her hands resting neatly in her lap. Her face was turned slightly toward the window, though it was impossible to tell what she was looking at, or if she was looking at anything at all. For a moment, you wondered how long she had been there. Longer than you? The thought passed quietly. You returned your attention to the forest. The fog moved differently here, slower, heavier. It wrapped itself between the trees, coiling softly around their trunks, drifting low across the ground. Occasionally, it would thin just enough to reveal something deeper within. A path, or the suggestion of one, It appeared only for a second before fading again, swallowed by the mist. The train did not slow. It followed its course as if nothing existed beyond the rails. Then, slowly, the trees began to fall away. The darkness opened. Ahead, something emerged. Stone. An ancient bridge stretched out into the fog, its wide arches rising from nothingness. There was no river beneath it that you could see, no valley, no ground at all. Just pale emptiness below, as if the bridge itself had been placed between worlds. The train moved onto it without hesitation. As it did, something changed. The air inside the carriage grew still, even more still than before. The candle flames lowered slightly, their light softening as if in response to an unseen presence. You felt it again, that quiet shift, not fear, but awareness, as though crossing this bridge meant leaving something behind, something you hadn't noticed until now. You leaned slightly closer to the window. The stone beneath the train passed slowly, each section worn and ancient, as if it had existed for longer than memory itself. The fog below moved gently, like a slow current, though there was nothing to carry it. The bridge seemed endless, longer than it should have been. Time stretched again, thinning into something almost unreal. You glanced down at your hands. For a moment, they didn't feel entirely your own. The sensation was subtle, like the feeling of waking from a dream and not yet remembering where you are. Your fingers rested against your lap, still, quiet, yet somehow distant. You closed your eyes briefly. When you opened them again, everything returned to normal. The carriage, the candles, the soft, endless motion. The bridge was gone. The train had returned to the fog, but something was different now. The light outside had changed. It was no longer the deep darkness of night, nor the pale gray of before. Instead, a faint glow spread through the mist, soft and distant, like the earliest hint of dawn. Shapes began to form again. Not trees this time, buildings. Low rooftops appeared through the fog, their outlines blurred and uncertain. Chimneys rose into the pale light, though no smoke followed them. Narrow streets stretched between them, empty and silent. A village. The train passed along its edge, close enough that you could see the details. The worn stone walls, the wooden doors, the small windows that reflected nothing but fog. There was no movement, no signs of life. And yet, it did not feel abandoned. It felt paused, as if time itself had stopped there, waiting quietly for something to begin again. You leaned slightly forward, trying to see more. For just a moment, near the edge of the road, you thought you saw something shift. A figure, small, still. Then the fog moved again, and it was gone. The train continued on. The village faded behind you, dissolving back into mist. Inside the carriage, the silence deepened. You turned your head slowly. The old woman was no longer looking out the window. She was looking at you. Her gaze was calm, steady, but there was something within it that felt older than anything you had seen before. Not unkind, but knowing, as if she understood something you did not. Neither of you spoke. Neither of you moved. The moment stretched quietly between you. Then, as softly as it began, it passed. She turned her gaze away once more, back toward the window, back toward the fading shapes of the world outside. And the train continued forward into the mist. The train moved on, leaving the silent village behind, as if it had never been there at all. The faint glow in the fog lingered, soft and pale, but it did not grow brighter. It simply existed, stretching endlessly around the train, giving just enough light for shapes to appear, and then disappear again. Inside the carriage, the stillness deepened. You shifted slightly in your seat, the wood beneath you warm and smooth. The candles continued to burn without flicker now, their flames steady, almost unnaturally calm. It felt as though the air itself had settled. You listened again. Nothing. No wheels, no tracks, no wind. Only the quiet presence of movement, felt rather than heard. Your fingers brushed lightly against the ticket still resting in your hand. For a moment, you considered looking at it again, but something held you back. Instead, your gaze drifted toward the aisle. The old woman was gone. Her seat stood empty, just as the others had before. You had not seen her leave. You had not heard her move. She had simply ceased to be there. A strange thought crossed your mind then, not of danger, but of distance, as though the people on this train were not leaving, but moving somewhere just beyond reach. You looked back to the window. The fog shifted again. This time, the shapes that formed were larger, heavier, mountains. Dark silhouettes rose slowly from the mist, their peaks fading into the pale sky above. The train moved between them, following a path carved through stone, though the rails themselves remained hidden beneath the drifting fog. The world felt older here, still, ancient in a way that did not belong to time. The light dimmed slightly as the mountains closed in, their presence pressing gently against the edges of the scene. Shadows stretched longer, deeper, though there was no clear source of darkness. Only layers, soft, endless layers. You leaned closer to the glass. For a moment, you thought you saw something carved into the rock. Lines, shapes, markings worn by age. They appeared briefly, then vanished as the fog moved again, leaving no trace behind. The train did not slow. It continued forward with the same calm certainty, as though it had traveled this path countless times before. Ahead, something else began to take form. A tunnel. Its entrance emerged slowly from the mountain, a wide arch of dark stone, its interior completely black. No light escaped from within. No detail could be seen beyond the threshold, just darkness. The train approached it without hesitation. As it drew closer, the air inside the carriage shifted once more. Cooler now. Quieter, if that was even possible. The candles dimmed, not extinguished, but lowered, their glow softening until the carriage was filled with a gentle, muted light. You felt it again, that quiet awareness, as though something was about to change. The moment stretched, and then the train entered the tunnel. Darkness closed around you instantly, not gradual, not fading, just complete. The windows reflected nothing now. The outside world had disappeared entirely, replaced by a still, endless black that seemed to absorb even the smallest trace of light. Inside the carriage, the candles burned faintly, their glow barely reaching the edges of the space. Shadows deepened, soft and shifting, though nothing moved to cast them. You remained still, listening, feeling. The motion of the train continued, smooth and uninterrupted, carrying you forward through the unseen. Time became difficult to measure, seconds, or minutes, or longer. There was no way to know. The darkness did not change. It simply remained. Then, slowly, something shifted. Ahead, a faint glow appeared. At first, it was barely noticeable, a soft light, distant and undefined. But as the train moved closer, it grew, spreading gently through the darkness, pushing it back without resistance. The tunnel opened. The train emerged once more into the fog. But the fog was different now. It carried light, not the pale gray from before, not the dim glow of dawn, but something warmer, softer, almost golden. It drifted around the train in slow, luminous waves, giving shape to the space without fully revealing it. You blinked, adjusting to the change. The carriage felt warmer again. The candles brightened slightly, their flames steady once more. Outside, new shapes began to appear. Not mountains, not trees. Something older. Ruins. Stone fragments rose from the mist. Broken walls, crumbled arches, scattered remains of structures long forgotten. They stood in silence beside the unseen tracks, their forms softened by time and fog. The train passed between them, and for a moment, it felt as though you were not just traveling through a place, but through something that had already ended, something that remained only in memory. The thought lingered quietly, then faded, and the train continued forward into the glowing mist. The ruins stretched on for longer than you expected. At first, they appeared in fragments, broken walls, scattered stones, arches that led nowhere. But as the train moved forward, they grew larger, more defined, rising from the glowing mist, like the remains of something that had once been vast and whole. You watched in silence. There was no movement among them, no signs of life. And yet, the place did not feel empty. It felt remembered, as if every stone still held the quiet echo of something that had once existed there. The train passed slowly between the ruins, its path steady, unchanging. For a moment, through the drifting light, you thought you saw figures. Not clearly, just shapes, standing near what might have been a road, or a courtyard, or the edge of a crumbling wall. They did not move, they did not approach. They simply stood, watching. You leaned slightly closer to the glass. The shapes faded, the fog shifted, and they were gone. The train continued. Ahead, something new began to form, a structure, larger than the others, an old station. It emerged slowly from the mist, its outline soft at first, then clearer as the train approached. The roof was worn, its edges uneven with time. The platform stretched beside the tracks, empty and still, lit by a row of dim lanterns that glowed faintly through the fog. There was no sign, no name, no indication that this place had ever belonged to the world you knew. The train slowed, not abruptly, not with sound, but gently, as if responding to something unseen. You felt it in the motion, in the way the air shifted, in the way the silence deepened. The train was stopping. You remained still, watching as the platform came into view. There were figures there, faint at first, then clearer. They stood in a quiet line along the edge of the station, their forms softened by the mist. Some wore cloaks, others simple garments, all of them still, waiting. No one moved, no one spoke. The lanterns beside them flickered slightly, casting long, slow shadows across the stone. The train came to a complete stop. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the doors opened. The same slow movement, the same soft wooden sound. Warm light from the carriage spilled outward, meeting the dim glow of the platform. No one boarded. No one stepped forward. The figures remained where they were, waiting. You felt it then, a quiet pull. Not strong, not urgent, just a gentle suggestion that you could stand, that you could step forward, that you could leave the train if you wished. You did not move. Your hands remained still, your breath calm. The moment lingered. Then, slowly, one of the figures stepped forward. A man. His face was not clear, but his movement was steady, certain. He approached the open door and paused for just a second, as if listening or remembering something. Then he stepped inside. He did not look at you. He did not look at anyone. He simply walked past, moving down the aisle until he found a seat, where he sat in silence, just as the others had before. The door closed, again without sound. The train remained still for one last moment. Then it began to move, slowly, gently, leaving the station behind. The figures on the platform did not follow. They remained where they were, their shapes fading gradually into the fog as the train pulled away. The lanterns dimmed, the station disappeared, and once again, there was only the endless mist. Inside the carriage, something had changed. You could feel it, not in the air, not in the light, but in the presence. There was someone new now, the man who had entered. He sat several rows ahead, his posture straight, his hands resting quietly before him. Like the others, he did not move, did not speak, just remained. You watched him for a moment, then turned your gaze away. Outside, the light began to shift again. The golden glow softened, fading into something cooler, quieter. The fog thickened, becoming denser, wrapping more tightly around the train. The world beyond the window began to disappear once more. But just before it did, you saw something, a shape, tall, still, standing beside the tracks. It was not part of the ruins, not part of the station. It stood alone, watching. You tried to focus on it, to understand what you were seeing, but the fog moved again, slow and gentle, and the figure was gone, as if it had never been there at all. The train continued forward, unchanging, endless, and the silence returned, deeper than before. The train moved deeper into the fog, leaving the silent station behind as if it had never existed. The golden light faded completely now, replaced by a softer, cooler glow. It was neither night nor day, just a quiet in-between, where the world seemed to pause and hold its breath. Inside the carriage, everything remained still. The new passenger did not move. He sat where he had taken his seat, his posture calm, his gaze lowered, as though he were listening to something far away. The faint light of the candles touched the edges of his figure, but his face remained indistinct, hidden in gentle shadow. You did not approach him. You did not speak. It felt as though words did not belong here. Outside, the fog began to thin again. Slowly, almost reluctantly, it parted just enough to reveal something new. Fields, wide and open, stretching endlessly into the distance. The ground was covered in a pale layer of mist, drifting low and soft, like a quiet sea that never moved. There were no paths, no fences, no signs of life, only the vast stillness of open land. The train passed through it without sound. For a moment, the space felt peaceful, not empty, not forgotten, just still. You rested your gaze on the horizon, though there was no true line to follow. only the fading shapes of the world dissolving into light. Then, gently, something shifted. In the distance, shapes began to form. Low at first, small, then clearer. A village. It appeared gradually, as if it had always been there, simply hidden beneath the fog. Simple houses stood in quiet rows, their roofs worn, their walls softened by time. Narrow paths wound between them, disappearing into the mist. But unlike the last village, this one was not entirely still. There was movement, faint, distant. Figures walked slowly along the paths, their forms blurred by the fog. Some carried baskets, others stood in doorways. A few moved together, their shapes passing silently through one another, as if they were made of the same pale light as the mist itself. You watched closely. No sound reached the train, no voices, no footsteps, only the quiet suggestion of life, continuing somewhere just beyond reach. As the train passed closer, you noticed something else. None of them looked toward you. None of them seemed aware of the train at all. It was as if you were moving through a world that could not see you, or one that existed in a different moment, layered over your own. The thought settled softly, without fear, just understanding. The village began to fade behind you, its shapes dissolving back into fog, its quiet movements swallowed by distance. And once again, there was only the open expanse. Inside the carriage, the air felt heavier now. Not uncomfortable, just deeper, as though the silence itself had weight. You shifted slightly, your gaze drifting once more down the aisle. The man was still there, but something had changed. He was no longer looking down. He was looking out the window, at the same moment as you. For a brief second, your reflections overlapped faintly in the glass. Two figures, side by side, both distant, both softened by the drifting light. Then the image shifted, and you were alone again. You leaned back slightly. The train continued forward, unhurried, unchanging. Then, without warning, the light outside began to shift once more. It dimmed, not into darkness, but into something softer, quieter, as though the world itself were closing its eyes. The fog thickened again, rising higher, wrapping itself more tightly around the train. The fields disappeared. The horizon vanished. Everything beyond the window was gone. Only the reflection remained. For a moment you studied it. Your face, your eyes, calm, still. But behind it, something else lingered. Not a shape, not a figure, just a sense that the space behind you was no longer as empty as it seemed. You did not turn. The feeling passed, or perhaps it simply moved further away. The candles flickered once, gently. The train did not slow, and the endless journey continued, quietly, steadily, into the unseen. The change came slowly. At first, you barely noticed it. The subtle shift in light, the faint dimming of the world beyond the glass. The fog, once pale and distant, began to gather again, rising higher, thickening, closing in around the train, as though the space itself were narrowing. The fields were gone. The horizon had disappeared. There was no longer any sense of distance, only closeness. The train moved forward, unchanged, yet everything around it felt quieter than before, as if the silence had deepened into something heavier, something that listened. Inside the carriage, the The candles flickered once, just once, then steadied again. You remained still, your gaze resting on the window, watching as the last traces of the outside world dissolved completely. For a moment, there was nothing, only reflection, only the faint outline of yourself seated within the warm glow of candlelight. Then, darkness. The train entered another tunnel. This time, it felt different. The darkness was not sudden, but gradual, as if the light itself were being gently drawn away. The fog outside thickened into shadow and then into something deeper, until the windows no longer revealed anything at all, only black. The candles dimmed again, more noticeably now. Their flames grew smaller, softer, as though the air itself had grown heavier, pressing down on them, asking them to fade. You listened. Still no sound, but the motion of the train felt closer, more present, as if the space within the carriage had narrowed, bringing everything just slightly nearer than before. You glanced down the aisle. The man remained seated, unmoving. But now, there was something else, further beyond him, at the very end of the carriage, a shape. You were certain it had not been there before. It stood near the door, still and indistinct, barely touched by the dim candlelight. Not fully visible, not fully hidden. You could not see its face. You could not even tell if it had one. And yet, you felt it, not watching, not threatening, just present. You looked away. The moment stretched quietly, the darkness surrounding the train without change, without direction. Time lost its meaning again. Seconds slipped into something longer, softer, undefined. Then, slowly, a light appeared. Faint at first, a pale glow ahead. The tunnel was ending. The train moved toward it, steady as ever, and as it did, the light grew, spreading gently through the darkness, returning shape to the world. The candles brightened, the air softened, and the train emerged once more. But what awaited outside was not what you expected. The fog had changed again. It no longer drifted low across the ground. Now, it hung higher, suspended in the air like a veil, glowing faintly with a soft, silvery light. It moved slowly, almost deliberately, revealing glimpses of what lay beyond, and then hiding them again. The train passed through a wide, open space. At first, it seemed empty, but then you saw them. Shapes, tall, still, standing at intervals beside the tracks. Statues, stone figures, worn and ancient, rising from the ground with quiet presence. Some stood with heads bowed, others faced forward, their features softened by time, their expressions unreadable. They lined the path of the train, appearing one by one through the shifting mist. Endless, silent, watching nothing, or everything. You leaned slightly closer to the window, trying to understand them. Their forms were human, almost, but not entirely. There was something about them that felt unfinished, or perhaps too complete, as if they had been shaped not to represent life, but to remember it. The train moved between them without slowing. One by one, they passed, each one slightly different, each one still. And then, something changed. Among the statues, one moved. Not clearly, not fully, just a slight shift. A tilt of the head, so subtle you might have imagined it. You held your breath, watched. The next statue passed. Still, then another. Still, the moment stretched, and then it was gone. The statues ended as suddenly as they had begun. The fog thickened again, closing over the space, erasing everything behind you. Inside the carriage, the air felt warmer once more. The candles steady, the silence familiar again. You leaned back slowly, your gaze drifting once more down the aisle. The shape at the end of the carriage was gone. The door stood there, closed, unchanged, as if nothing had ever been there at all. The man remained seated, still looking forward, still unmoving, and the train continued its endless journey through the mist. When you looked down the aisle again, something felt wrong. Not dramatic, not sudden, just quietly wrong, in the way a room can feel unfamiliar, even when nothing obvious has changed. The man who had boarded at the nameless station was no longer there. His seat sat empty, lit by the same calm candle beside it, its wooden surface untouched, undisturbed, as though no one had occupied it at all. For a moment, you searched the carriage instinctively, letting your eyes move from one row to the next. But there was no sign of him, no sound of footsteps, no opening door, no movement, only absence. You let your gaze rest on the empty seat for a little longer, waiting for some explanation to form on its own. None came. The train continued forward. Outside, the mist had changed again. It drifted lower now, no longer hanging high in the air, but spreading across the ground in long, pale sheets. Through it, little by little, a landscape began to appear. Fields, wide, open and silent, stretching far into the distance beneath a dim and colorless sky. The train moved through them with the same impossible smoothness as before, and the endless rows of pale grass bowed slightly beneath the weight of the fog. There was something peaceful about the fields. After the tunnels, the ruins, the statues, the nameless stations, the openness felt almost gentle. You watched as the world unfolded beyond the glass. At first it seemed empty, but then, slowly, details emerged. A narrow footpath running beside a line of stones half sunken into the earth. A wooden fence, old and leaning, appearing for only a moment before disappearing back into mist. A cart standing alone in the distance, its wheels half hidden in pale grass, as if left there long ago. And then more. The faint outline of a well, the roof of a barn, a road that curved away and vanished. It did not feel like a place abandoned. It felt like a place paused, as if life had once moved there in ordinary, quiet ways, and then simply stopped in the middle of a breath. You rested your temple lightly against the cool window and kept watching. The train passed a cluster of trees, standing alone in the field, their branches bare and pale, reaching upward into the dim light. Beneath them, for the briefest moment, you thought you saw people. 3 figures, still, facing the tracks. Their forms were soft in the mist, almost transparent, and before you could study them, the train had already gone by. You did not turn to follow them. Some part of you already knew that looking back would show nothing at all. Inside the carriage, the silence seemed deeper than ever. The candles did not flicker. The wooden walls held the warmth of their glow, and yet everything felt slightly further away now, as though the carriage itself had stretched. You looked toward the rows behind you. Empty, ahead of you. Empty. Every seat visible from where you sat was unoccupied. For the first time, the idea settled fully into your mind. You might be alone. Not simply traveling alone, but truly alone on the train. The thought did not bring fear. Not exactly. It brought a strange, hollow quiet, a feeling like standing in a vast old hall and realizing every other voice has long since gone silent. You lowered your eyes to your hands. The ticket was still there, resting between your fingers. Its surface felt smoother now than before, warmer, as though it had been held for much longer than the journey itself. You turned it over again. The back was still blank, but when you looked at the front, the symbols seemed different, not changed completely, just clearer. You still could not read them, but they no longer shifted as much when you tried. They seemed closer to meaning now, as if you had traveled far enough for them to begin revealing themselves. Beneath your name, something faint had appeared. A line, then another. The shape of letters, almost forming a word. You stared at it for several seconds, willing it into clarity. Before it could resolve, a sudden brightness drew your eyes back to the window. The fields had given way to water. A lake stretched beside the train, still as polished glass. A narrow bridge of dark timber carried the rails across it, low and straight, vanishing into drifting fog at the far end. The surface of the lake reflected the pale sky and the faint lights of the train with such perfect stillness that it was difficult to tell where the world ended and its reflection began. The train passed onto the bridge. Even without sound, you could feel the change beneath you, the subtle sense of height, the open space around the carriage, the great quiet expanse to either side. You looked down. The water was so smooth it seemed unreal, and in its reflection, the train lights trembled very slightly, stretching in long golden lines across the dark surface. For a moment, it was beautiful enough to erase every other thought. Then you noticed something impossible. In the reflection, there were more windows lit than there should have been, more light, more carriages, as though the train beneath the water was longer than the train above it. You blinked and looked again. The reflection wavered gently. The extra lights remained for a second, and then were gone. Only the ordinary glow of your own carriage remained, long and thin upon the black surface. You stayed very still until the bridge ended and the lake slipped away behind the curtain of mist. When land returned, the light outside had begun to change again. It was warmer now, softer, a muted gold spreading through the fog in thin layers, the kind of light that belongs to late afternoon when the world begins to quiet itself for evening. The fields became hills, low at first, then steeper, their slopes covered in faded grass and scattered stones. Far in the distance, through a break in the mist, a shape rose above the land, a castle. Its silhouette was faint, almost unreal, standing upon a height far from the tracks. Towers softened by distance, walls blurred by fog, banners unmoving in air too still to carry them. The train curved slightly, giving you only glimpses of it between folds of land and drifting white. Each time it appeared, it seemed both nearer and further away, as though it belonged to another road, another journey, one running silently beside your own. You watched it for as long as you could. At one point, a final shaft of golden light passed through the mist and touched the highest tower. For a brief moment, the stone seemed almost luminous, as if lit from within. Then the fog gathered again and hid it completely. The sky darkened slowly after that, not into full night, not at once, but into the deepening blue of evening. The candles inside the carriage seemed brighter against it, their warm reflections trembling faintly in the glass. You looked at your own reflection again. For a moment, it was only you. Then, just behind your shoulder, another shape appeared. Tall, still, not close enough to touch, but close enough that you should have felt someone standing there. You turned immediately. No one. Only the empty aisle, the candle-lit rose, the polished wood, and the closed door at the end of the carriage. When you faced the window again, your reflection was alone. Outside, the last of the golden light faded. One by one, faint stars began to appear in the darkening sky beyond the mist, small, distant, and cold. Their light barely touched the world below, but somehow their presence made the night feel less empty, as if something far above was quietly keeping watch. The train moved on beneath them, steady, silent, endless, and as the stars multiplied, scattered thinly across the deepening dark, you felt a strange certainty settle over you. Not that the journey was ending, but that it was carrying you towards something you had been approaching far longer than this night, far longer than the moment you stepped onto the platform, perhaps far longer than you had ever known. You rested back against the seat and let the movement hold you. The fields, the lake, the hills, the distant castle, all of it slipped quietly behind, dissolving into night and fog. Ahead, only darkness waited, and the train continued into it, as calm and certain as ever. Night settled fully around the train. The last traces of evening disappeared, leaving only a deep, quiet darkness beyond the window. The stars remained, small, distant points of light, but even they seemed softened by the mist, as though seen through a veil that dulled their brightness. Inside the carriage, the candles burned a little stronger now. Their warm glow filled the space with a steady calm, reflecting faintly in the glass beside you. The wood around you seemed darker, richer in tone, absorbing the light and holding it close. You sat still, letting the motion of the train carry you forward. At some point, without noticing when, you became aware of a subtle change. The air felt closer, not heavier, not colder, just closer, as if the space itself had narrowed slightly, drawing everything inward. You lifted your gaze. Down the aisle, at the far end of the carriage, the door was no longer the same. It had not opened, it had not moved, and yet, something about it had changed. A faint line of light traced its edges, soft, barely visible, as though something stood beyond it, waiting. You watched it for a while. The light did not flicker, it did not grow, it simply remained. Then, slowly, your attention returned to the window. The fog outside had thickened again, but not in the same way as before. It no longer drifted aimlessly. Now it moved with a quiet direction, flowing gently past the train in long, smooth currents, like water carried by an unseen tide. Within it, shapes began to form. At first, they were indistinct, just variations in density. Then clearer, tall structures. Ruins again, but different from those you had seen before. These were not broken or scattered. They stood intact. Ancient buildings rose from the mist, their walls smooth and pale, their windows dark and empty. Towers stretched upward, their tops disappearing into the low-hanging fog. Long corridors and archways passed beside the train, one after another, like the remnants of a place that had once been vast and ordered. The train moved through them, not around them, through them, as though the tracks themselves had been laid within this forgotten city. You leaned closer to the glass. The buildings were close now, too close. Close enough that you could see details, the worn edges of stone, the faint carvings along the walls, patterns etched so deeply they had survived whatever time had done to this place. And yet, there was no sign of life, no movement, no sound, only presence. The train passed beneath a long archway, its shadow falling briefly across the windows. For a moment, the candlelight dimmed, and the interior of the carriage reflected more clearly in the glass than the world outside. You saw yourself, still, calm, and behind you, nothing. The reflection held, then shifted. The archway ended. The outside returned, and with it, something else. Figures. They stood along the edges of the structures, spaced apart, unmoving. Their forms were clearer than before, not like shadows, not like mist. People, or something very close to people. They faced the train as it passed. Some stood with heads lowered. Others looked directly toward the windows. None of them moved. None of them spoke. You felt no fear, only a quiet recognition, as though this place and these figures were not unfamiliar, as though you had passed here before, in some way you could not remember. The train continued. The structures began to thin. The figures faded. The fog returned. Inside the carriage, the candles flickered softly once more. You leaned back slightly, letting your gaze drift again toward the end of the aisle. The door. The faint light around its edges had grown just a little stronger, still soft, still quiet, but clearer now. You could see it without trying, as if it had drawn closer, even though it had not moved at all. A thought came to you then, simple, unforced, that when the door opened, something would change. Not suddenly, not violently, but completely. You did not stand. You did not move toward it. You remained where you were, letting the moment pass as all the others had. Outside, the fog began to thin again. This time, it revealed something new. Not ruins, not fields, not villages, but a wide, open expanse of dark ground stretching into the distance, broken only by faint lines that crossed it in careful, measured patterns. Paths, or boundaries, or something else entirely. The sky above it was deeper now, almost black, and the stars shone more clearly here, their light cold and steady, untouched by the drifting mist. The train moved across this open land, unhurried, unchanging. You watched as the patterns on the ground passed by, repeating, shifting, forming shapes that almost made sense, but never quite did. And slowly, very slowly, you became aware that the train was no longer the only thing moving. Far in the distance, across the dark expanse, something else shifted. A line, a faint, moving line of light. Too far to see clearly, too steady to be natural. You watched it for as long as you could. Then the fog rose again, gently, quietly, and hid it from view. Inside the carriage, the door remained closed, the light around it steady, waiting, and the train continued forward, toward whatever lay beyond. The moment came quietly, not with a sound, not with a sudden change, but with a feeling, a subtle shift in the air, as if something long awaited had finally drawn near. You felt it before you saw it. The train was slowing, not abruptly, not enough to notice at first, but gradually, gently, the endless motion that had carried you through fog and silence began to soften. Outside, the darkness began to change. The mist parted, slowly, carefully, as though revealing something it had been hiding all along. A shape emerged ahead. At first, only a suggestion, then clearer, a station, not like the others. This one stood alone in a wide, open space, untouched by ruins or fields or mountains. The ground around it was smooth and pale, like stone worn by time, stretching out in every direction beneath a quiet, starlit sky. There was no sign, no name, no mark of where you were, only the platform and the waiting stillness that surrounded it. The train moved closer, and as it did, you noticed something strange. There were no figures, no passengers waiting, no silent watchers in the fog. This place was empty, completely, and yet it did not feel abandoned. It felt complete. The train came to a stop. For the first time since you had boarded, the motion ended. The silence remained, deeper now, full. You sat still, your hands resting lightly where they had been for so long, your breath calm, your thoughts quiet. Then, the door at the end of the carriage opened, not slowly as before, not with hesitation, but smoothly, naturally, as if it had always been meant to open at this moment. The soft light beyond it filled the aisle, warmer than the candles, softer than the fog. You looked toward it. For a moment you did not move. There was no urgency, no pressure, only the quiet understanding that the journey you had been on was reaching something, not an end, but a point of arrival. You stood. The movement felt simple, easy, as though your body had been waiting for it. The wooden floor beneath your feet was warm. The candles flickered gently as you passed, their light brushing softly against your hands, your shoulders, your reflection in the windows you no longer needed to look at. The carriage felt different now, not empty, but finished. You walked slowly down the aisle, each step steady, each breath calm. When you reached the open door, you paused, not because you needed to, but because something within you chose to. You looked back. The carriage stretched behind you, quiet and still, filled with the soft glow of candlelight. Every seat, every shadow, every flicker of flame remained exactly as it had been, and yet it no longer felt like a place you belonged to. It felt like something you had passed through, something that would remain even after you were gone. You turned forward again and stepped out. The platform was smooth beneath your feet, cool, still. The air felt different here, clearer, lighter. The fog was gone. Above you, the sky stretched wide and open, filled with stars that no longer seemed distant, but present, steady, watching. You took a slow breath. For the first time, it felt full, complete. Behind you, the train remained where it had stopped, silent, waiting. For a moment, you thought it might stay, that it might remain there, as it had always seemed to, unchanging, endless. But then, without sound, it began to move again. You turned slightly as it passed. The carriages glided by, one after another, their windows glowing softly in the night. For a brief moment, you thought you saw figures inside, shapes seated in stillness, facing forward, just as you once had. Then the last carriage passed, and the train entered the mist once more. But this time, it did not leave it behind. It carried the mist with it, and slowly, gently, it disappeared, leaving only the quiet platform and the open sky. You stood there for a while, not waiting, not searching, just being. The space around you did not feel empty. It felt whole, as though everything that needed to happen already had. In the distance, beyond the edge of the platform, a path revealed itself, narrow, softly lit. It did not appear all at once. It unfolded gradually, as though responding to your presence, forming beneath your gaze. You did not question it. You did not hesitate. You began to walk. Each step felt certain, natural, as though you had always known this path, even before you saw it. The station remained behind you, still, silent, unchanging. And ahead, there was no fog, no uncertainty, only a quiet, endless space, waiting without expectation. The stars above seemed brighter now, closer, their light steady and calm, guiding nothing, demanding nothing, simply existing. You continued forward. The path stretched on, not towards something you needed to reach, but through something you were already part of. And as you walked, the memory of the train softened, not disappearing, not fading, but settling into something gentle, something understood. The journey had never been about where it would end, only that it would carry you exactly where you needed to arrive. And now, you had.